You are standing on a steel deck as dawn thins a gray Pacific sky. The sea is as flat as rolled tin. Off the bow, the horizon is crowded with ships, transports heavy with men and crates, destroyers throwing white beards of wake as they zigzag and mutter in semaphore. Someone jokes that the weather is finally on your side. Someone else says nothing, because the wind smells of fuel, and fuel means fire, and fire at sea has only one ending. The loudspeaker crackles. The convoy grinds forward. In the distance, a black dot pulses against the light, disappears, and then returns, lower than any sane pilot would dare. Weeks earlier and 1,000 miles away, in a heat-sour hangar where rain drummed a private rhythm on corrugated roofs, a mechanic's wrench slipped and clanged across the concrete floor. The man watching the airplane wasn't a typical officer. He wore his rank casually, like a borrowed hat, and spoke the language of shop floors and flight lines. Paul Irvin Pappy, Gunn had spent 2 decades flying and fixing aircraft before anyone thought to call him an engineer. He wore grease on his knuckles like it was proof. In front of him stood a B-25 Mitchell, glass nose removed, nerves exposed, a future stamped in rivets and doubt. By the book, this airplane was wrong. Where a bombardier should kneel under plexiglass, 8 heavy machine guns now filled a solid metal nose. Their bores aligned toward a point the crew had measured and remeasured on a canvas target out behind the trees. Cheek blisters flanked the cockpit like clenched fists. The top turret was locked forward and slaved to a trigger that would let the pilot pour every ounce of forward fire without asking permission from physics or tradition. The first time they test-fired it, smoke seeped through seams they had never noticed, and the fuselage trembled like an animal trying not to bolt. Gunn looked at the shutter, made a small note, and told the crew to reinforce the mount. Problems were just decisions you hadn't made yet. He had not set out to pick a fight with a rulebook. He'd set out to save time. Time meant ships that never reached beaches. Time meant a convoy broken up in daylight. Time meant weeks off a war, which might mean days off a prison sentence for his wife and 4 children, locked behind barbed wire in Manila. Pappy examined the B-25's spine, the weight creeping forward in the nose, the small arithmetic of center of gravity and recoil, and decided. If the airplane demanded a pilot who flew with both hands and all of his nerve, then the tactics had to change around the airplane, not the other way around. General George Kinney understood that logic on sight. He had inherited an air force that could put bombs in air, but not on target. High altitude looked precise on a chalkboard, but a ship with a helmsman and a heartbeat could turn 90 feet between the time you opened your bomb bay doors and the time you found your camera switch. The first idea that actually matched reality came from an old game every child knows. You skip a stone. Except the stone weighs 500 pounds, the fuse waits 4 or 5 seconds, and the splash against a ship's side happens at the single place the armor is thin and the water is merciless. Skip bombing had a problem. It asked you to fly into a storm of tracers at a height where the ocean looks like an unfinished thought. The solution was ugly and perfect. Drown the gunners in lead before they could get their fingers to grips. Pappy's fix made the bomber its own escort. A B-25 with a strafer nose could rake the deck, cut the air out of an enemy's lungs, and then toss its bombs like skipping stones. The choreography was brutal. Beaufighters went first to sandblast the decks with cannon. The B-25S followed at wavetop height, a heartbeat later, to skip and kill. The convoy that would test every assumption was not a rumor, but a schedule. Intercepts whispered it together in fragments. Rabaul was assembling 8 transports with 8 destroyers to guard them and fighters to patrol the air. Nearly 7,000 troops, with the kind of experience you don't replace by writing a memo. Laos was their destination, and Laos sat like a thumb on the map of New Guinea, pressing down on every Allied plan. If they got through, the jungle would get a second life. If they did not, the jungle would eat only what it already had. On paper, Japan had cover. The season's storms, a horizon stitched with squalls, long blue walls of rain that could hide a fleet from prying eyes and exhaust. The first Allied bombers that found the convoy scored the usual kind of success: claims in the log, holes in the air, and ships that twisted out of the way. It bought time and nothing else. Kenny did not care about headlines. He wanted geometry. He wanted the convoy forced into positions that made low-level attacks simpler to set up and harder to dodge. In a map tent that stank of marker ink and canvas, squadron leaders rehearsed a ballet nobody could dance slow. Approach lines crossed and uncrossed under the lamplight. Beaufighters would come in first, low and brutal, hammering gun nests and bridges. Mitchells would split in elements and come straight down the throats of the transports, close enough to read the rust in the scuppers, close enough that spray stitched across the cockpit glass in small comets. P-3HS would tie up the zeros higher, where the sky was cold enough to hide mistakes but not forgive them. Everyone had practiced on a wreck just off the coast until the maneuvers were muscle memory. Everyone knew the price for being half a second late. Now the horizon is not just a line, but an answer. The beehive sound arrives before shapes. Beaufighters show first, their noses blinking like angry lighthouses. The destroyers spit back at them, tracers sewing upward in bright chains that look too beautiful to be fatal. The first strafing pass plows the decks. Men fall as if gravity suddenly remembered a debt. Hatches slam. Doors flutter open and shut with fleeing feet. Someone yells in a language you do not know. When the Beaufighters break away, the air tastes like metal, and the ship's guns hesitate just long enough for the second act to enter. The Mitchells arrive at a speed that feels not like flying, but like a decision you cannot reverse. The ocean is not a picture. It is a texture, and your whole field of view is spray and gray and a target swelling faster than your hands can count. The pilot opens fire at 1,000 yards, and the airplane changes shape. The nose a furnace, the cockpit a cage full of shockwaves. Tracers carve lines that climb toward the bridge, sawing masts, peeling away railings, turning gun crews into smoke-colored motion that does not move again. There is no time to watch anything. The bomb release distance lives in the nerves of your wrist. 2 500-pounders drop away and skip true, a long hop and a shorter one, and then they vanish under the waterline like stones. The pilot hauls back. The airplane complains. Behind you, the ship folds. The explosion is not a flash, but a shove. When the blast finally booms through the cabin metalwork, the plane is already climbing, and the deck behind you is not a deck anymore. On the next run, the crew can hear a different racket. A twin mount on the destroyer has lived long enough to find them. The pilot holds just a breath longer so the forward lock turret can chew at the thread, and it does. A clean bite that makes the gun collapse backwards like a man at the wrong end of a bad argument. The Mitchell rides the shock and shoulders past the plume that used to be a smokestack. Someone in the back shouts, "Clear," in a voice that's half report, half prayer. Another element comes in too high, then too low, then just right. Across the convoy, transports stagger and turn. The ships that try to hide behind others only end up crowding the fatal zone, where a bomb that misses one target simply finds the next. A destroyer tries to thread the needle between two burning hulks, and the needle snaps around it, steel collapsing in an arc that spits men into the water like seeds from ripe fruit. The sea remembers to burn. Black circles boil on its surface where oil floats and fire walks. Up above, fighters weave a net. The P-3HS have drawn the zeros into a higher war of spirals and crossing wakes. Down here, the pilots do not have seconds to glance upward. They can feel the friendly cover only in the absence of white streaks slanting at them out of the blue. When one Mitchell finally takes a hit, it is not a clean hole but a handful of fragments that find the engineer's leg, the navigator's map, the space between two ribs. The pilot refuses to measure the damage, because there is still a transport in the nose glass and the bottles with the delayed fuses are not yet empty. If you were on a Japanese bridge in this hour, the world would sound like your ship tearing itself apart. Telephone lines go dead. Orders run on feet. The helm answers, but the rudder does not. Men point where there is nothing to point at. The sky is full of enemy wings and the ocean is full of smoke, and distances have shortened until everything is either right here or gone. A young officer shouts to close watertight doors, then realizes the door he wants shut is no longer connected to the part of the ship it was meant to guard. He can taste cordite and salt, and the faint sweetness of raw paint turned to vapor. The second Allied wave is calmer, not because anyone is less afraid, but because there is less to shoot back. The transports trail lists like tilted sentences. A destroyer that should be guarding throws its wounded flank between a bomber and a ship with troops still crowding the rails, and the choice costs it its spine. The Mitchell that kills it flies through a fountain of debris and comes out looking like a scrap dealer's dream, scabbed in flecks of paint and rust that only make the airplane look meaner. When the bombers finally peel away to rearm and the Beaufighters rocket past one last time to slap down any surviving gunner with more courage than sense, the convoy is not a convoy. It is a scatter of decisions that did not work. Men cling to flotsam. Oil turns their faces into masks. In the distance, a handful of shapes still try for at a speed that admits surrender without signaling it. The air is a little cooler now because the fire has made its own weather. The only sound that carries is the sea licking at fresh edges. Later that day, the bombers return like a bad dream that remembered your address. This time the attacks are deliberate, unhurried, methodical the way good carpentry is methodical. Surviving ships die in isolation. A damaged destroyer that once threw up a wall of flak now makes only small noises as a single Mitchell lines up and finishes an argument that began in the morning. The pilots do not cheer. They are too tired and too busy thinking about fuel and approach lanes and the fatiguing arithmetic of where smoke will drift as they pass. At a forward strip, the air tastes of hot oil, and victory none of them will ever call by that name. Mechanics swarm the Mitchells with a ritual that looks like love and is actually speed. Ground crews slap the fuselage like you slap a friend's shoulder in a bar after a narrow escape. Everyone counts holes and then quietly counts heads, and the quiet has too many numbers in it to be comfortable. Someone tapes over a crack. Someone else mutters that the turrets need another half-turn worth of freedom next time. Pappy walks the line without a clipboard. He points at a scab of paint-deforming mirror-cheek gun and says two words that change a habit they didn't even know they had. He will spend the night with an engineer's ghosts, center of gravity figures, recoil charts, belt feeds that sometimes kink when the barrel heat pushes past the comfort limit, ammunition boxes that might be better moved a hand's breadth aft. He is not searching for perfection. He is trying to match the airplane to the way pilots actually fight. If a pilot's wrist remembers to release at 300 yards when spray is in his mouth and the hull is all he can see, then the mount should be trimmed for that memory, not for what a pleasant afternoon on a test range suggests. The next days will deliver messages that sound like rumors and end as history. Of 8 transports, none will unload at Lai. Of 8 destroyers, only half will return to write reports that will be read by men who scrub those same reports for errors that look like excuses. Thousands of soldiers who were supposed to turn a map brown will never see the shore. Some will die in the water. Some will be hauled back to a base that was supposed to be a springboard and will now be a trap. Air power has a new verb for ships, to unconvoy them. The human cost sits on both sides of the ledger. In Manila, a woman who has not seen her husband in years hears artillery that is both too close and not close enough. Children learn the shape of ration bowls and the weight of the word soon. Letters make their slow way through censors' hands, and the paragraphs that survive are careful in a way love never wanted to be. When the Santo Tomas gates finally swing under an American column's momentum, the noise sounds not like joy, but like an old hinge freed. Pappy will stand on a different airfield, his arm wrapped and useless, and try to assemble a face that is not a stranger to his children. The airplane he fathered will grow heavier in the nose as factories add a cannonment for bunkers and bravado, and pilots will argue in mess tents about the trade between recoil and satisfaction. The strafer kits will multiply. Gun counts will climb. At WEWAC, low-level doctrine will cut the lungs out of an air force on the ground, and the smoke will teach the same lesson the convoy learned. That altitude is a luxury time and distance don't always buy. At Rabaul, the fortress that could once whistle up ships and sorties like a magistrate calling court will learn to hunch its shoulders when Mitchells arrive at mast height with their mouths full of fire. What remains after the noise is a change in the relationship between courage and outcome. Before, a pilot could be brave in the wrong way, level and high and tidy, and bring home a film of misses to be circled with a pen. After, courage must be low and fast, and imprecise in every sense except the only one that matters. The sea itself becomes part of the weapon. Water is not just something you fly over. It is the last surface a bomb touches before it does the one thing a ship cannot forgive: explode inside the place where buoyancy is supposed to live. When historians draw lines, they draw one through this convoy. Daylight resupply within range of Allied airfields withered. barges bred in mangrove shallows. Submarines took the most valuable cargo and preyed to mechanics and luck. Night became a habit, but night has its own predators. Radar found wakes. Moonlight did not ask permission. The Southwest Pacific tightened like a belt, one notch and then another, until garrisons that were once claws became islands with no hands. There is an argument that technology answers everything. That argument ignores the man in the hangar who built a new answer out of scrounged guns and stubbornness. He was not the only one who mattered. Wars never let that single story stand. But his refusal to accept that the way we've always done it was a plan saved lives measured by numbers that will never appear in any citation. A transport sunk far from a beach is a battle unfought. And a battle unfought is a letter that never has to be written home with a tone that can ruin a kitchen forever. Years later, at an air show, a B-25 will rumble down a runway and lift with the same bullish grace it had when everything it did was urgent. Children will clap before they understand why the sound reaches their ribs first. On some examples, blank ammunition will throat through restored noses and the barrels will pulse and the air will shake. And somewhere in the crowd a veteran will close his eyes because for a second he is back inside a cockpit that smelled of sweat and oil, and the human need to make the second pass better than the first. There is no moral neatness to the sea when fire walks on it. There is only steel and men and the small inventions that change the angle of the next minute. The strafer nose was one of those inventions. So was the decision to lock a turret forward. So was the idea to treat a bomb like a stone and the ocean like a table. Each was a step away from abstraction and toward the ugly place where wars are either shortened or made longer by the way someone thinks in a room with bad light and good tools. You still taste salt. The day's heat moves like an animal along the skin. The convoy is gone. In its place are rafts and oil and the blunt knowledge that for every ship missing from the horizon, there is a platoon that will never fire at a jungle tree lean or hold a hill or make a stand that a different narrator would later call heroic. Sometimes the bravest thing anyone did was to build an airplane that removed those moments from the calendar. That is not romance. That is arithmetic with blood and fuel in the margins. Paul Pappy Gunn did not win the Pacific War. No one person did. But he altered its slope. He taught an airplane to speak a new language at 50 feet. And then he taught crews to think at that altitude until the thinking became instinct. And instinct became doctrine. And doctrine became the thing enemies fear. Predictability. It is an odd word to use for an ambush, but that is what this became. If you sailed within reach of a strip the engineers could hack out of jungle, you would meet low wings with forward teeth, and the meeting would be brief and final. The war would run on after the convoy's bubbles had flattened. The men who flew this day would fight again and again, some to the end and some past it. Pappy would carry his scars into a peace that was not kind enough to last. But somewhere in the lives that were spared by ships that never arrived are legacies that will never have to learn the names of islands by heart. The sound of a Mitchell at mast height still means something. It means that a problem that seemed permanent turned out to be a question, and questions can be answered with steel and sweat and a refusal to let the previous method own the next result. Before there was a convoy to break, there was a city to leave. Manila had smelled of hot pavement and diesel and the patient hum of an airline built to make islands feel connected. Pappy ran it like a father runs a big, mildly unruly family. He kept airplanes honest with his hands and routing tables honest with his head. He had a wife who could turn a house into a center of gravity and 4 children who treated airfields like backyards. The Pacific had not yet decided that all maps were temporary. War does not consult calendars. It takes what is near. Bombers put geometry where streets used to be. At Nichols Field, Pappy learned what helplessness sounds like when you can count airplanes burning with names you know. He did what pilots do when the ground becomes an argument. He flew. He flew into places where the odds were worse than the weather. He flew out of places that did not want him to. He put medicine on a runway that no longer had a welcome sign. He dragged courage into cockpits that were never meant to be brave. And every time a mission ended with his wheels under him, the quiet afterwards said the same thing, not enough. Because the people who mattered most were on the wrong side of a fence he could not reach. Orders can be just. They can also be a shorthand for something too complicated to say out loud. When he lifted for Australia with a handful of high-value passengers and no family, he made the choice officers make when they are out of choices. In the weeks that followed, the news that finally found him was the wrong kind. Internment, a university turned into a prison, the names of his wife and children folded into lists kept by men who had keys. The anger that settled into him was not theatrical. It was a quiet furnace that ran on the only fuel he knew: work. The work began with airplane guts. The A-20 Havoc was the first patient because it was closest, and because a light bomber is easier to bully than a medium one. Out came the bombardier's glass and the habit of treating a nose like a window instead of a weapon. In went 4 Brownings and a wiring harness that let a pilot think like a fighter jock in a bomber's skin. Pappy pulled guns from wrecks, mounts from imagination, and certainty from the way metal flexed when it shouldn't. At Buna, the new doctrine arrived at treetop height and left a runway full of wreckage that used to be airplanes and a handful of gunners wondering why there had been no time to aim. George Kenney did not need a slide deck to understand what he was looking at. He needed only his own sense that air power was supposed to be an argument the enemy couldn't interrupt. He took Pappy out of the category called problem and dropped him into the category called answer, gave him a title that fit on one line and authority that did not. The order was as short as it was impossible. Do more of this, to more airplanes, faster than anyone thinks is reasonable. The Mitchell was next because it could carry the idea farther. 2 engines made space for risk. A long, roomy nose made space for guns. The first B-25 that came out of the shop looked like a dare. 8 holes up front, cheek packs, a top turret that refused to spend its life watching the sky. The center of gravity slid forward like a man moving toward a fist fight. Pappy answered with ballast and a patience that smelled like solvent. He built a harmonization rig out of wood and plywood, and the faith that bullets should meet each other in front of the airplane instead of arguing about directions. He pulled the trigger himself and adjusted until the tracers wrote one sentence. Tactics grew out of the hardware the way vines take shapes from trellises. A skip bomb had to be released at a range your nerves could measure without a ruler. A pilot had to start firing before his brain finished the math. Crews practiced on a dead ship until the air tasted of powder and the sight picture lived behind their eyelids. The next step was choreography. Beaufighters first to peel gun crews off their mounts. Mitchell's next to turn decks into splinters, and the bombs last to deliver the finality water adds to everything. Intelligence did its own kind of carpentry. Intercepts found the rhythm inside coded syllables. Reconnaissance drew dotted lines between white wakes. Weather plotted excuses and removed them. On a forward strip cut from jungle ribs, the briefings dropped into place with a satisfaction you rarely earn in war. This is where they will be. This is how we will meet them. This is where we will leave them. You do not often get to say it that simply and mean it. The attack happened the way we already told it, because truth has the bad habit of refusing to change for fresh retellings. But there is room here to stand closer to the men inside those airplanes. You can smell hydraulic fluid and cordite and the acid that builds in the back of the throat when the airframe shakes under a forward-firing storm. You can see hands that never quite stop moving, feathering a touch of rudder, easing a trim wheel a click at a time, tapping a gauge because tapping is a way to feel less helpless. You can hear the bombardier learning to be a gun loader or a map reader or the kind of extra pair of eyes that saves lives by seeing not just where a ship is, but where it will be after you have already committed to a line that takes your airplane within a human breath of metal. On the convoy's bridges, there were men who had won things before. Many had fought in places that had given them confidence with interest. They were not cowards. They were professionals in a profession that changes shape when the enemy invents a new question. They tried what they were trained to do. They threw their ships into turns and fired at angles that had worked against torpedo planes and medium bombers that stayed respectful. What they met instead were pilots who did not intend to be respectful and weapons that only make sense if you accept that the safest place is sometimes the narrow gap between the worst options. When the convoy died, the war did not pause to send out a summary. The effect showed up as absence. Units in New Guinea waited for men who did not arrive, for guns that would never be unloaded, for food that never left crates because the crates never touched docks. The next week, infantry patrols found enemy positions that fought with the stubborn cruelty of soldiers who already understood that resupply was a rumor. The month after that, staff officers in faraway rooms argued about night schedules and barge lanes and whether submarines could pretend to be freight trains. Daylight convoys within reach of Allied strips simply stopped appearing like they had learned manners, and the manners were fear. Pappy's war moved with the same kind of momentum. Range was a constant insult, and he answered with an idea that sounded illegal mostly because it was put extra tanks where bombs usually lived, drain them dry, and kick them out through the floor before the attack, so the bomb bay can remember what it is for. Crews grumbled about fumes and drafts and the occasional fuel-slick boot print where no boot print should be, and then they flew farther and hit things that had previously sat just beyond the map's comfortable edge. Wewak was one of those edges. The enemy had treated it like a long, air in, defiance out. The doctrine that bled the convoy now bled an air force. Low-level Mitchells and A-20S came fast along the water and then turned inland with the sun at their backs and the ground close enough to count grass blades. Fires walked across dispersals. Aircraft tried to lift and met a sky already full of answers. By day's end, the count looked unreal until you realized that the math had changed. When you take away altitude and surprise in the enemy's favor and give both to yourself, the tally always feels like cheating to the side that loses. Rabaul was a different beast, fortress by geography and intent. Once, saying the name out loud put a weight on sentences. After Wewak, even fortresses learned humility. Mitchells went in with smoke that grew out of white phosphorus and a plan that treated the harbor like a maze. Top cover tied up the fighters. Low ships died first because they were both valuable and reachable. A cruiser took a hit that made even men who had seen many ships hurt go quiet. When the airplanes turned for home, the harbor was a calendar torn across its middle. While the front advanced, factories tried to keep up with the ideas. Stateside engineers loved the notion of turning a bomber's nose into a thesis about firepower and asked the obvious American question, how big a gun can we bolt in? The answer arrived in the form of a 75mm cannon that made every crew chief sigh, and every pilot grin and then swear because a grin is not a flight characteristic. The cannon did what cannons do, broke things slowly. Loading was an art you practiced seated on your heels in turbulence, and firing brought a recoil that made the airplane feel like it had just stepped into an argument with a doorframe. There were missions where the big gun mattered, and more where the business was still best done the old-fashioned way, with a river of .50 caliber lead that found every living thing that could pull a trigger and taught it not to. The B-25 changed its silhouette again and again, the way fighters change faces when they lose and have to become meaner. The dorsal turret walked forward in the fuselage to put its teeth where they could help in the first second, not just the last. Cheek guns sprouted like second thoughts that proved to be correct. Waist guns grew from windows. The count reached a catalog number that looked absurd until you remembered the jobs these airplanes were doing. There is such a thing as intimidation that saves ammunition. An enemy who has watched a strafer pass at mast height does not need a second demonstration to understand what is coming next time. Pappy went home for a stretch not to rest, but to teach a factory what a field seemed to know by instinct. In Englewood and Kansas City, he stood over drawings and pointed where the metal needed to be thicker and where the weight had to move. He reminded men with sharpened pencils that recoil is a conversation between a gun and a fuselage, that ammunition is both mass and plan, that a pilot's hands are part of the system and cannot be asked to grow a third finger for a clever switch. When the first production gun noses rolled out with real part numbers and inspections that ran longer than any Southwest Pacific afternoon, he flew them hard enough to make the pain honest, and then told the engineers what still rattled. Back forward, the war had shifted to chains of islands with names many Americans would learn only once and then forget. The Philippines returned to the daily weather report of pilots who had begun their war there and meant to finish it there. Low-level attacks stitched across bays and river mouths. Barges, once a footnote, became headlines because they could hug coastlines and play hide-and-seek with mangroves. The strafer was a natural barge hunter. A deck gun is an argument at 100 yards that ends fast when 4 or 8 or 12 Brownings arrive at 50. Some nights the sky glowed where it shouldn't. Enemy bombers dropped white phosphorus that crawled and clung, and a man on the ground learned how fire behaves when it meets sweat. Pappy's scars from one of those nights were not the kind you could salve with a medal. He carried the ache in his shoulder like the price tag for a career of flying too close to things other men built to be dangerous. The wound took him out of cockpits for longer than he liked. and then the war itself did the rest of the subtraction. In Manila, the gates that had held his family opened for someone else's tank. A column flowed through so fast that freedom had to trot to keep up. Weeks later, after logistics did the kind of kindness only logistics can, a man who had made a religion out of efficiency stood awkwardly in a room full of people whose names he had not said out loud in too long. Reunions rarely fix anything that broke. They make a new shape that is better and also different. They sat together and tried to make sentences that could carry 3 years. The children had learned patience as a second language. His wife had learned that love can be a series of tasks with no finish line. Pappy discovered that the hardest part of vengeance is that it does not trade evenly for what was taken. He did not stop working. He just understood more clearly what the work could and could not buy. The last year of the war was a long unraveling for the enemy in the Southwest Pacific. Every plan they made had to route around the absence the convoy's loss had taught them. Every road was a question about fuel. Every island asked whether the next delivery could outrun airplanes that no longer needed to be high to be safe. When surrender finally appeared, it did not look like relief to the men who had spent years learning how to be useful. It looked like the sudden removal of a purpose that had been both burden and compass. After the shooting stopped, the Mitchell did not instantly become a museum piece. It hauled cargo and people and memory for a while, until newer shapes took over and the airplane slid into that part of aviation where history lives beside nostalgia. Veterans built associations that gathered under hangars and around coffee urns. They told stories that got simpler where pain had once complicated them, and more complicated where time had rounded edges. The B-25S sound at an airshow became a reliable way to find the men whose eyes were on the inside of their heads as the airplane passed. Pappy's life in peacetime was a version of the same sentence he had always written. He fixed things and flew things, and tried to put people where they needed to be, across water and distance and weather. The end, when it came, wore the same clothes as his beginnings. A cockpit, a storm, a line that became a caution. It is easy to say that a man died doing what he loved. It is truer to say that he died doing what he believed was useful, which had been his measure for love all along. What his story leaves us with is not a diagram, but a habit. When the job won't yield to approved tools, look for what the job is really asking. If the enemy's strongest defense is time to aim, take the time away. If altitude gives the defender comfort, make courage the altitude that matters. If the book says the nose should be clear, ask whether the book is about a different war. If a bomber cannot find a fighter to escort it, teach the bomber to be its own fighter for the first few seconds that matter most. The men who climbed into strafer-nosed Mitchells were not thrill-seekers. They were practitioners of a craft that punished sentimentality. They flew low because low worked. They loaded guns until the airplane looked like a dare, because that dare made a convoy rethink whether the ocean was a friendly place. They dropped bombs not where a camera could catch a clean splash, but where water would help the blast do the ugliest, most efficient thing possible. Efficiency is not a heroic word. It is a word for people who want a war to end. There are other stories that can be told inside this one. A navigator in a strafer who learned to read the sea's texture as if it were a map. A Japanese destroyer officer who made a correct decision a second too late and went into the water with his men, not because orders told him to, but because habit did. A ground crew corporal who learned how to safety wire a mount by feel in the dark because daylight belonged to fighting and night belonged to preparation. None of those names will ever be as large as a general's, and that has always been one of war's smaller injustices. You can stand, if you want, in a modern museum under the wing of a Mitchell that wears a paint scheme rebuilt from photographs and memory. The rivet lines catch the light in a way that makes the airplane seem both tough and tired. If it is a strafer configuration, the nose looks like a fist. Children count barrels the way children count candles on a cake once a year. Somewhere nearby, a docent tells the story about the convoy that never reached last, and a visitor who did not come for detail walks out into the sun knowing a new number and a new name. There is a temptation to make the ending meet, to say that a modification born in a humid hangar ended a war weeks earlier and saved thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost. Both pieces of that are probably true in part and false in detail. What is true without qualification is that the modification changed how days felt for men on both sides. On Allied strips, Pilots walked to their airplanes with a different kind of confidence. On Japanese bridges, officers scanned horizons with a different kind of worry. Between those two moods, history found a path that led faster to its conclusion. The sea today is the same color it was then when you catch it in the same light. It takes no side and holds no grudges. Ships pass, and airplanes cross the sky without anyone thinking to lock a turret forward. Somewhere, someone else is looking at a problem that looks immovable. Somewhere, someone else is reaching for a wrench. The day after a victory is the most dangerous day in a squadron. It tempts you into believing that the world has learned its lesson. It hasn't. The enemy adjusts. You adjust again. The adjustment after the Bismarck Sea was both tactical and logistical. Tactically, crews learned to be choosier about approach lanes, to let instinct vote only after training had spoken. Logistically, commanders wrote schedules that felt like sleight of hand. Launch time spread so that a single weather change didn't break a mission's spine. Fuel loads trimmed to keep takeoff runs short on soft strips. Spares pushed forward not because they were needed, but because they would be needed. Pilots talked through the fight until it became a shorthand. 1,000 yards for the first squeeze. Close one eye if the sight picture floats. Don't chase tracers. Let the harmonization do its work. Watch the spray for crosswinds. Release when the ship's bow looks indecently large. Climb like you mean it because the water will not negotiate. They argued about prop pitch and burst length and whether it was better to re-attack a transport that was already hurting or brake toward a clean target whose deck guns were still in the argument. The answers varied with experience. The rules grew out of repetition. Never get predictable. Never go alone. Never finish so low that the wake looks like a wall. The men who built the airplanes found their own rhythm. They kept lists that lived in their heads. Which mounts loosened after how many passes, which barrels needed to cool for how long before a feed jam became a certainty, which ammunition boxes like to settle into a rattle that meant an empty lane by the time you most needed a full one. They learned the scent of a failing hydraulic line the way a baker knows the moment flour and water stop being separate things. The best of them carried spare patience in their pockets for the nights when storms turned tents into laundry and still had an airplane ready before breakfast. By mid-1943, when the calendar had spent itself into a different year's kind of war, the strafer idea had stopped being an idea. It was a fact that enemies planned around. Barges that once ran by day now used shorelines like curtains. Convoys stacked their deck guns where the first Beaufighter pass could not strip them in a single rake. Fighters held altitude until they could choose a favorable dive rather than throwing themselves into a low-level tangle that already belonged to the attackers. None of it restored the old comfort. It merely kept the losses from looking like the summary of a disaster every time someone tried to move something important. One afternoon at a field where the dust lived in everything, a young pilot climbed down from a Mitchell and put his hand on the metal as if to apologize. He had misjudged a release and thrown a bomb long. The skip had been wrong because the sea had a different texture over a shadowed patch. He said it out loud so the next crew could add that patch of ocean to a mental map that had no latitude and longitude, only lessons. This is how organizations get better in wars that last long enough, not with doctrine letters alone, but with human sentences spoken without vanity. Beyond New Guinea, the Philippines returned like a promise kept. Landings stitched into headlines. Airfields changed hands. The enemy drew shorter and shorter supply lines, and still came up against the same problem. Wherever they tried to run something important, low wings would find it and chew a lane through it. The strafers legend grew to include missions that were not famous but mattered, destroying a train that fed a garrison, breaking a road where trucks had nowhere else to go, blowing apart a fuel dump that had taken months to hide under camouflage that fooled photographs, but not men who knew how jungle should smell. Somewhere in this period, Pappy crossed from being a man who made changes to being a man whose changes were how other men did their jobs. It is a subtle shift and a heavy one. He still argued with numbers and balance and fingers on triggers realities. But he also argued for an attitude, an intolerance of comfortable failure. He never mistook courage for a plan. He never treated improvisation as a religion. He believed in building a better starting point and then drilling until the good choices were the easy ones at a speed that made thought a luxury. He carried his wounds into that work. Pain has a way of taking up room where reflection might have been. He used the pain the way he used every other limitation, as a prompt for design. If a lever is hard to reach on the third pass when a cockpit is shaking and a man's arm doesn't swing the way it used to, move the lever. If a sight is hard to read when your world is spray and glare, change the sight. If a loading drill assumes two good hands, rewrite the drill so the other crewman can take the step that needs taking without 3 words of explanation. This was not heroism. It was professionalism rendered in hardware. The enemy did not lack professionalism. Their pilots were brave. Their destroyer captains were skilled. Their infantry fought with a tenacity that makes easy moralizing an insult. What they lacked, increasingly, were answers that could be manufactured as fast as the problem changed shape. The Allied edge in production is a phrase that gets repeated so often that you can forget what it looked like from ground level. It looked like an airplane that went to sleep broken and woke up ready. It looked like fuel that arrived when arithmetic said it should. It looked like a man with a wrench and a deadline and parts that fit the first time. When the war bent toward its conclusion, the Mitchell was there in the air like punctuation at the end of paragraphs that had taken years to write. The airplanes escorted a surrender delegation because it felt right to have witnesses who knew exactly how much it had cost to make this day possible. They flew a little higher on that trip, and nobody minded. The roar was the same. The intent was different. In peacetime, memory takes different jobs. It teaches, it warns, it comforts. The story of Pappy's strafer knows as does all 3. It teaches that approved is not the same as effective. It warns that every enemy becomes wise if you give him time. It comforts by showing that a problem can yield to a modest tool wielded with stubborn clarity. A hanger, a handful of Brownings, a pilot's trigger finger, a gang of ground crew that refuses to be impressed by the size of the task. None of these look grand in a parade. All of them add up. If you ask veterans why this mattered to them, the answers lean quiet. Fewer ships on the horizon meant fewer friends who had to crawl up beaches against fire. Fewer convoys meant fewer letters written to mothers with apologies in every sentence. Fewer Japanese soldiers reaching New Guinea meant fewer Americans and Australians and Papuans dying in jungles that did not care who owned them. The arithmetic of logistics is bloodless on a page and bloody in a foxhole. A transport sunk at sea is a rifle that never finds a shoulder. Decades later, a restoration crew will decide whether to give a surviving Mitchell a glass nose or a metal one. The debate will touch on accuracy and availability and the appeal of letting museum guests see the Bombardier station. Someone will bring up the strafer configuration and watch eyes light because it feels honest to the story we are telling here. They will cut and rivet and prime and paint. When they finish, the airplane will sit with its nose like a clenched jaw, and visitors will not need a paragraph to understand what this airplane did for a living. You can argue, if you like, about which innovation mattered most in the Southwest Pacific. Code breaking, long-range navigation, better engines, new radar, improved radios. It is a false hierarchy. Wars end when enough of the right things point the same way. Pappy's contribution made other contributions louder. Intelligence without delivery is trivia. Courage without a workable tactic is loss. Engines without a target are noise. The strafer nose connected those elements like a switch that finally closed a circuit. There is a last image worth keeping, not the explosion under a transport's waterline, though that will always have its own grim gravity. Keep instead the image of a mechanic palming a hot barrel with a rag as he swaps it out, counting to himself, knowing exactly how many seconds before the next crew needs him to be 2 steps ahead. Keep the image of a pilot sitting alone on a step with a canteen, replaying a too-late release in his head and promising to trust his training a fraction sooner tomorrow. Keep the image of a child in a museum pressing a hand against glass to get closer to a row of guns that are only metal now, and a father kneeling to tell a story about a man who would not accept the word impossible when the people he loved were behind a fence. The story of the convoy that never made laugh is one story. The story of the man who helped write the way it ended is another. Together, they explain why sometimes the most humane thing a warrior can do is to become more efficient at breaking what must be broken. It shortens the calendar. It saves the living from meetings they were never meant to attend. It is not pretty. It is necessary. If you listen to a Mitchell idle at the edge of a runway today, the sound will roll up your ribs the way it did in 1943. It will go light as the throttles come forward and then heavy again as the airplane rotates and leaves the ground the way a promise leaves a mouth. Confident because it has rehearsed. The airplane will be a survivor, a veteran by proxy. It will carry ghosts with more ease than it once carried bombs. Every once in a while, at a special event with extra permissions, the nose guns will bark blank fire into daylight, and the crowd will startle and then laugh at themselves for startling. And somewhere a man who knows better will nod, because surprise is the point. It was always the point. There is no final bow in this kind of story, only a fade. The credits belong to too many people to list. Somewhere near the top, in a font that does not try to be fancy, you would put the name of a man who looked at an airplane that was good and made it useful, who endured what he had to and kept moving toward a practical mercy. He did not build beauty. He built an end.